Welcome to our webinar, Clinical Trials 101. My name is Richie Kahn, and I'll be your moderator today. A little background on me. I'm a health policy professional by training, clinical researcher by trade, clinical trial participant by choice, and patient advisor by necessity. Believe it or not, I learned that I was losing my vision while working in ophthalmic drug and device development. I decided to turn those lemons into lemonade and work to build awareness of clinical research as a care option, as well as the importance of getting screened for symptom-free vision loss. Glaucoma Research Foundation kindly invited me to moderate today's webinar, and needless to say, I'm very excited to explore everything you want to know about clinical trials. Before we do, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Aerie Pharmaceuticals, for their continued support of our webinar series, as well as of glaucoma patients everywhere. Thank you to all who submitted questions during registration. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer general glaucoma questions today, but please be sure to visit the Glaucoma Research Foundation website, where you'll find recorded webinars, articles, and invaluable reference material all about glaucoma. I would now like to introduce Dr. Sayoko Murai. Dr. Murai received her medical degree as well as her PhD from Ohio State University. She then went on to Duke University Eye Center for her internship and residency. After that, she completed a fellowship at Kellogg Eye Center at the University of Michigan. Dr. Murai stayed at University of Michigan and after 25 years of service, returned in 2020 to her alma mater, the Ohio State University, where she serves as chair of the Department of Ophthalmology and Visual Sciences. Please welcome Dr. Sayoko Murai.
Thank you very much, Richie. I appreciate that introduction. And it's truly a privilege and honor for me to be part of this event in this webinar this evening. So my greetings to all the guests that are on here, and also my gratitude to the Glaucoma Research Foundation and the sponsor. And maybe just a little story, as Richie shared with himself. It turns out my father had pretty severe, what's called normal pressure glaucoma. That was part of my motivation to head into glaucoma. Today, the topic is going to be on clinical trials. And before I do that, I just shared some of my financial disclosures, but none of these have relevance to this presentation here. What are clinical trials? I'm going to cover that in slight answers and here in number 1 and number 2. Clinical trials are usually here to identify new and safe glaucoma drugs. I just show this infographic here from a recent publication in Proteomes in 2016 to let you get an appreciation of finally getting one drug here. How many have to be screened between 5,000 to 10,000 in this stage that may take several years to find the right amount of compounds, where they show you get down to 250 and then perhaps your short list of 5 and do these clinical trials at this point where it's in humans. So it takes a long time to get to our medications. Another type of clinical trial is identifying new and safe glaucoma surgeries. Many of you are likely familiar with MIGS or microinvasive glaucoma surgeries, and this is actually pulled from the Glaucoma Research Foundation website. Many of you have probably heard of these terms, ECP. It's a type of laser that's an alternative laser for treating glaucoma by lowering pressure. What's called a GAT procedure, which again is an outflow drainage procedure. Of course, IOP means intraocular pressure, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. And then this term, as I said, is MIGS. That's the very sort of common approach, but still our tried and true trabeculectomy as well as tube shunt surgeries are very important. As far as other types of glaucoma trials, some that look at the impact of glaucoma treatment and the order approach have been very helpful in management. And you can find these at the National Eye Institute website here, which is posted at this link up there. Lastly, there are investigator-initiated clinical research. And I'd just like to share that a number of your doctors in your professional colleagues, perhaps if there's some here, are actively doing glaucoma research to help improve the outcomes and hopefully to find a cure. This is demonstration here of my study coordinator colleague, Jesse Gilbert, demonstrating to a subject how to use what's called the eye care instrument. And this is part of my clinical trial. So why do we have clinical trials? One, it's really to make sure that it's safe and effective for patients with glaucoma. So there are different ways to look at this with experimental treatments, new drug developments, as I mentioned, new approaches to surgery or other interventions, such as lasers or even some forms of radiation, but that's usually more for oncology, of course. Discover better disease prevention approaches. And then we learn a lot if we analyze the individuals who participate in these for potential risk factors for disease. So for example, we understand that a thin cornea increases the risk for glaucoma. So we use that to decide who should probably get treatment started. As far as body factors, we're still learning about that. We know that individuals who have low blood pressure tend to have more progression. And a great deal has been learned now about genetic factors through these large international collaborations. And soon, I anticipate, hopefully within 10 years or so, we'll be using genetics to help understand more about the disease progression in terms of glaucoma. We are still learning about diet factors that may impact glaucoma and progression, as well as environmental factors. Then lastly, we want to discover new improved diagnostic approaches for glaucoma and hopefully detect it sooner and before progression becomes severe. How do I learn about clinical trials? Well, there are several places where you can look through your computer. One is through the National Eye Institute, and they have a website link here that describes some of the nationally funded clinical trials. Another good site is clinicaltrials.gov. And on the screen here with the computer screen, as you can see, you can type in the type of trial you are looking for. You can put in the name of an individual if you know somebody as far as who may be directing the study. And then you can actually narrow it down to location even further than that so you can see what's around you. Another important source is to check your local CARES website through your eye care provider or perhaps through the university. And so oftentimes on the website, they will have information about clinical trials. As far as learning about this, we really, really value your participation because it will help the care for in the future. But oftentimes we learn more about you individually as far as the glaucoma. So search for clinical trials. But before you join one, please talk to your physician about whether that study fits you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sai. Up next, we have our Q&A, where we'll be joined by Kayla Knoll, Clinical Research Coordinator from Ohio State University. Like Sai, Kayla also studied at Ohio State, where she received her undergraduate degree in biology and a master's in pharmacology. Welcome, Kayla.
Hello, Richie. Thanks for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, as Dr. Moray stated earlier. So I'm happy to share this evening with all of you and excited to answer some questions.
Kayla and Sai, let's start off. Question 1. How can I participate in a clinical trial? How does a patient enter a study? Does your doctor invite you? And can a patient ask if their doctor would consider them for a trial?
I can start off with this one. That's a great question. So at Ohio State University, we are a research institution, and so we do have a lot of different studies available. A lot of our physicians are very much aware of the studies that we're conducting and will often approach some of their patients on their own if they feel like that patient might be a good candidate for a trial. If you don't live near an institution, or if your eye doctor perhaps doesn't work at one where they conduct a lot of research studies, as Dr. Moray shared in her presentation, you could certainly use your phone or your computer and go to one of those websites that she discussed. Clinicaltrials.gov is an excellent resource. As Dr. Moray stated as well, you can really use a lot of those filters to find very specific studies that you are interested in or that are really specific to you. So whether it's the specific type of glaucoma you have, or if you're interested in a specific type of treatment in a clinical trial, you can use all of those to filter through different studies on that website to find one that you might be eligible for. And a lot of times they have some sort of contact information listed there as well for somebody that you could reach out to, email or call on the phone to see if you might be eligible.
Great, thanks, Kayla. Sai, what about you? Any thoughts on this one?
Now, many of my patients ask me questions of, can we do better? Can we, avoid these side effects of the eye drops or surgery? And I would love to be able to do that for them, but we need research and we need data to help us, guide us to do better for our patients. So I very much appreciate patients who are interested in research, and all the resources that Kayla just had mentioned are extremely valuable. So please participate. I've done so in other types of research studies, and it's very helpful.
Thanks, Sai. And I'll add to that, as both a participant myself and a clinical researcher who's conducted glaucoma trials as well. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of doctors are not aware really of how to participate. They don't participate in clinical research as a care option. It's not because they don't believe in research, they don't understand the need, or the fact that none of the products you can take for treatment of your glaucoma had to make it through clinical trials. It's because so often the industry does a less than fantastic job educating them about what's involved, how to get involved. So a lot of, unfortunately, the burden of getting involved in clinical research often is on the patient. That's why, resources like Glaucoma Research Foundation, hand in hand with clinical trial listings like clinicaltrials.gov, clinical trial matching to antidote.me, can help you find a clinical trial near you, can help you learn about a trial. And oftentimes, once you found a trial, you can bring them to your doctor's attention, learn more. But what it ultimately comes down to answer the point about how does a patient enter a study, these clinical trials are very much like a big recipe book, right? So for Thanksgiving, every year, my wife has a fantastic Thanksgiving playbook. It's got a turkey shaped like a hand, she stenciled the turkey. And it tells her, how to put in the macaroni and cheese and the pumpkin pie and the turkey using the various temperature settings and time requirements to kind of juggle everything. And it's very specific. So like that Thanksgiving playbook, you have a protocol which is going to determine exactly how a clinical trial needs to be conducted. And a very important part of that protocol, Kayla, I'm sure you spend a lot of time in there, is the inclusion and exclusion criteria section. That's what spells out point by point which patients would not only be ideal for participation in the trial, but it also explains the rationale why. So for example, you might be very interested in clinical research, but perhaps you have other conditions that would make it really hard to analyze your data in a glaucoma trial. Bless you, Sai. So that would spell out exactly which trials are a good fit, which trials are not as good of a fit. But it's always a great idea to do your research, do some reading. And if you don't hear about clinical research from a clinician or a care provider you trust, to bring it to their attention. Absolutely. Fantastic question. All right, Michelle, I think we just kind of answered question 2 about discussing with your ophthalmologist or care team first, but always important to discuss clinical trial options with loved ones, trusted community members, clinicians, everyone who's involved in your care team. Absolutely.
Yeah, Richie, I'll add one thing to that. I just want to say,
please.
One of the most important priority always in any type of clinical research is the safety of the subjects who participate. And that is really what guides a lot of the eligibility in any of these clinical trial protocols. I mean, we want to make sure that the people who are participating are not going to be put in any sort of, harm's way or danger, or have any sort of increased, hopefully, really severe side effects and things like that. And so there is very strict criteria in order to be able to be eligible, which again is why it's so important for you, if you're thinking about it, to talk to family members, to talk to your physician about it. If you do have other conditions, your physician might know if that condition might be exacerbated or affected by a clinical trial. So we always want to make sure that you are always protected, always safe, and that your health does come first. So.
Great point, Kayla, and a wonderful reminder. We have a related question here about how is a person approved to participate in a clinical trial? I think we just touched on that with the inclusion and exclusion criteria, but just to put a fine point on it, again, there is a very particular patient population that will be a good fit for a particular clinical trial. There are a wealth of glaucoma studies out there. They're not right for everybody, but there are often trials for a wide variety of patients, myself included.
Yeah, maybe if you
right.
don't mind me adding to that, Richie,
Please.
as part of those in what's called the inclusion where you fit and exclusion where somebody doesn't fit, a big part of that is using the data that you already have in your clinical care. So for example, the pictures taken of the optic nerve, also the visual field tests, all of those are very helpful information for knowing if you would fit for a particular clinical trial.
Yeah, and with that, if you are interested and you speak to the research team conducting that study and they think that you might be a good fit, often what's involved is something called a screening visit, where they will invite you to come to that facility and will typically perform a pretty in-depth eye exam, even though these all these patients have had eye exams before. We really want fresh, as most recent pictures, most recent eye data as we can. So we will look at, past pictures like Dr. Moray said and things like that, but we'll use that screening visit to take all new information, all new eye exams, and really look at that to see where you currently are in your disease and on that day where you stand to determine if you might qualify. So there's a lot of information and a lot of data that really goes into it that the research team has to kind of look at to make sure that you would be a good fit.
Absolutely. Sai, question for you first. We have a lot of interest in placebos. The particular question was, my understanding is for some trials, some patients get placebo. I can't miss my eye drops. How does this work? So if you could first talk about and explain a bit about what placebos are and when a trial would have a placebo arm and when it might not.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think most patients are very nervous when they hear about the word placebo. And so that type of study would be designed for including individuals who still have pretty healthy optic nerves, because we want to see the effect. And when we say placebo, usually that means for an eye drop or medication where one is in a masked bottle, you can't tell what it is, and the other one is in another bottle. And again, one is marked maybe 1, the other one 2, or some sort of marking system so that the study coordinators and the study team know which one is which. And the reason that is so-called the gold standard for some clinical trials is because, number one, we really know eye pressure fluctuates a lot. So when we have a new medication, how do we know that the eye pressure change is due to, one, your normal pressure fluctuation and it's just going down, or is it due to the medication itself? And so the gold standard is to use a placebo, what we call sort of randomized approach to treatment, where one group of patients may get the placebo for a certain period, the other group of patients may get the new medication, and then there would be what's called a washout, and then perhaps a crossover where each arm gets it. So there's different types of designs to look at that, but the intent is to really make sure that new medication is effective to lower pressure. And I'm sure many of you have tried, I call it the glaucoma drop juggle, because it looks like the medicine doesn't work. And so the pressure doesn't lower. And so then you try something else. So it's very important that when we look at new medications, we truly feel the data is telling us that, yes, this medicine's effective in lowering medications or lowering the eye pressure, excuse me. In terms of surgery, it's quite difficult to do a sham or what's called placebo surgery because, we can tell which eyes had surgery to judge that. So in surgery situations, it's quite difficult to be able to do that type of intervention. And so mainly the outcome there, as far as any surgical intervention, is to look at the eye pressure lowering, making sure to document any complications. And then a big challenge for all glaucoma surgeries is scarring. And so we have not been able to address that very effectively. It's very difficult to make sure the pressure reduction is long lasting as we battle scarring.
All right. This is one of the questions I really enjoy here. Are participants required to live in the city where a study is being conducted?
I
that
can
one
start
for,
with that one
for
as
Kayla?
well.
Okay.
Yeah, I can start. Dr. Murray can probably touch on it a little bit more, but that is a really great question. And I would probably say that it depends. Oftentimes, at least for our clinical trials, it is usually a pretty good requirement. We get some people who live in neighboring states and are able to make it in, but usually with a lot of clinical trials, they involve very frequent or very regular appointments with the research team. So it would usually be to your advantage as a participant to live closer to the facility and in order to get there on time, because it is very important that we get the data that we need at the visits. And usually those are within very specific time frames. So there's usually only a few days or a week or two window where we need to bring you in for that appointment. And so if you miss that, we're not able to collect that data. And oftentimes that's becomes an issue for the study. So usually, yes, there are some studies out there where it would be possible to talk to you from afar, but usually those aren't clinical trial based as much. Again, these are really studies that are focusing on intervention and treatments. And so we want to see you in person to make sure that we can conduct the visual acuity exams and have the doctor look at you in person in order to make sure that treatment is working or if it's not working.
Now, something to add to that, fantastic answer, Kayla, and I think that was true almost 100% of the time pre-pandemic. It's certainly true the majority of the time now. But if there is one silver lining to COVID as it relates to clinical research, I think we've learned that a lot of these traditional methods for recruiting patients for clinical trials are taking the necessity for patients to travel to brick and mortar sites hasn't always been possible. So we've had to find another way, right? Thinking about the US specifically, right now, 75% of potential patients live more than 2 hours away from a clinical trial site. So it's really hard not only to make the commitment to deal with logistics, but to take time off work, to find a babysitter, to find a dog walker, to deal with the expenses for overnight visits, gas, parking, food, hotel rooms. So one of the things that has really dramatically improved during the pandemic, and this is the stuff I do in my full time, is the concept of decentralized or remote clinical trials. So by that, I mean, imagine you have a glaucoma study, much like Kayla just described, where you have 5 visits. And visit 1, you would go to the clinic, you would confirm all of the information you've reported, you'd have that visual field exam performed, the OCT, all of your typical exams. If you qualified for that clinical trial, you would theoretically have your investigational medication dispensed. You'd then go home. And if there wasn't a need to perform a full ocular assessment at the next visit, there are a couple of things you could do. There's this concept of the electronic patient-reported outcome assessment. So you could use your phone, an application, could go to a web address, and you could report any interactions you've had, any side effects that you think have been experienced as a result of participation, or just that you've noted in general. You would complete things like a medication diary. You would note any inflammation, swelling, or redness. That information would be sent to your clinical care team, Kayla and Sai, for example. At the same time, while it's a lot harder to perform assessments on the eye virtually, there are a number of options, whether sending a optometrist with a mobile slit lamp to a patient's home, or remote pressure monitoring using virtual reality goggles or at-home pressure monitoring. There are a lot of different things you can do. So the end result there is you might come in for that very first office visit. Maybe you come in for that fifth and final office visit, but maybe you don't have to drive to the clinic for visits 2, 3, and 4. And you don't have to worry about all those logistical challenges. So will that be the norm going forward? I think we're going to see more and more of it. Or we're going to have these fully remote trials where you never have to go to the clinic becoming very prevalent? Not anytime soon, but there are more options now than we had in 2019. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, that's a good point, Richie. Go ahead, Dr. Morgan.
Yeah, thank you. So Richie, thanks for mentioning that, because our sort of standard norm now is office-based visits for clinic care. And certainly it's true also for clinical trials. But there's all sorts of technology being developed now. And one of them that I showed in my slide deck was what's called the eye care home. I formally received a grant for them for a clinical trial at Michigan, but I don't have any current funding. But I will say that having the patient help us collect more data, I think is going to be extremely valuable. And I make the analogy to people who have diabetes and have the continuous glucose monitor now. I think for certain individuals, one, whose insurance can pay for that technology, first of all, and two, who have that technical know-how to be able to use the cloud to get that type of data and have them help themselves to be more sort of engaged in taking control of their own sort of metabolism and sugar control. I think we will get there for glaucoma with pressure monitoring. It won't be good for everyone, but I think we'll be able to customize treatments more. And I will tell you that that is part of the purpose of my current funded research, is to look at that aspect with the eye care home instrument.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree with you, Dr. Murray. I think it is so important to also understand how, people are handling these treatments at home. And I think, pre-COVID and when these, remote visits were not as popular and we didn't have all these methods to be able to directly communicate with people while they were in their own at-home setting, it was difficult to understand exactly how they were handling medications or treatments and things like that. And it makes people, I think, more willing to participate if they don't have to come in quite as frequently. But one thing that has also definitely changed with the pandemic is a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies, at least, who are conducting some of these larger clinical trials, are willing to actually reimburse sometimes subjects for driving to and from the clinic, or to pay for their meals if they need to, stay over lunch or over dinner in order to come to these appointments. So depending on what type of clinical trial you're in, that is definitely something that you should discuss with the research coordinator or with the head physician of the study or something like that, just to see if that's a possibility, because these companies and us as researchers really do appreciate all of the time and understand that it is difficult sometimes to be able to come in for visits. So we want to make it beneficial and worth it to you as a participant as well.
Absolutely, Kayla. A couple quick comments, then a question for you. I think you touched on this a moment ago. Whether talking about eye care or some of these other devices for at-home monitoring, having used a number of them myself, I think some of the huge potential benefits for patients, irrespective of ease of use or lack thereof for some of these technologies. Oftentimes when we go to see our doc, it's between 9 and 5, Monday through Friday. We don't have a lot of information about what happens to our eye pressure at night or early in the morning. So using these devices like the eye care You can simply, when you get up in the middle of the night to let the dog out or have a glass of water, you can check your IOP and you can find out whether or not your pressure spikes or perhaps drops precipitously in the middle of the night, because that can really inform your care. The other thing you can do, there are a number of different companies of technology that let you do a visual field exam and share that information directly with your care team. So if you are between visits, maybe you're not going to see your doctor for another 3 months, you can have that supplemental information shared with them. And if anything looks askew or abnormal compared to what you typically experience, hopefully you can head off a problem sooner rather than later that way. So Kayla, my question for you, you talked about, there are some instances now with some of these larger pharmaceutical companies and clinical trial sponsors where they will reimburse for more. But the particular question is, does my insurance cover the cost of visits and testing, or is that covered through the trial? What out-of-pocket expenses can we expect? So thinking about a typical trial, and I don't know if there is such a thing in your world, what sort of expenses are not going to be covered as part of clinical trial participation?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the answer does kind of, again, vary depending on the exact clinical trial. Generally speaking, from especially our trial standpoint, almost anything that's required in that protocol for the study, so things that are expected of us to do. For example, if we need to check your glasses prescription, or if we need to give you a certain type of eye drop, if it's a surgical trial and you need, antibiotic eye drops before or after the surgery, or if you, if it's a clinical trial for, a currently approved eye drop or something like that, all those things are covered under the study. So again, we really want to try to minimize the cost to you as a participant. That is something, if you know of a trial that you're participating, again, it's very important to talk to the coordinator and the physician on the study about that, because they could give you specific instances of things for that specific study where, if they were to happen, would not be reimbursed to you. Sometimes trials, if they have some type of a side effect that occurs where you might need to see an outside doctor, you would have to pay for that outside doctor appointment from your own insurance, and then you would ask the study to reimburse you for that. So it was something that you would initially have to pay for, but that would again be reimbursed after the fact, depending on the company. Or if you have something while you're in a trial that happens that's not related to the study. For example, if you're in a glaucoma trial and you have to go to the hospital for some type of a tonsil surgery or something like that, those things would not be covered by the research study because they're not deemed to be related normally to the study.
Thanks, Kayla. All right, next question. Do trial participants get to discuss their experience with each other, or do they not even get to meet or interact with others? You know how sometimes you have to go to a lawyer and you pay him a couple $100 an hour, and the very sage legal advice you get is a shrug and it depends. So I'll let you talk about the dependencies here and why that might be the case.
Yeah, so you very aptly heard Kayla mention that several times as far as it depends. And even when I have residents, med students ask me a question, I can't say a hard and fast yes or no. And my answer is always, it depends. Here we know so much science about glaucoma, but it still remains an enigma. If you go to many websites and ask or sort of search, what's the definition of glaucoma? Well, there's optic nerve damage, and we say there's a characteristic type of vision loss with this. And while I wish we could be more specific than that, it's true. There's so much, I don't want to say art in a negative way, but all of you patients, I'm sure, know with your relationships with your doctors, there's not a hard and fast yes, no. So we all understand that pressure's normal range is 10 to 21, but people still get glaucoma with their pressures being in that normal range measured during office hours. So to Richie's point, having some of that technology to see what your pressures are doing in the real world, when you're out and living, that can inform us quite a bit. Not all doctors, I will let you know, you are comfortable using that technology. And I will inform you that I helped start this eye care home program at Michigan. We now have established it at Ohio State. And there are several other places in the country that have essentially what we call a library of eye care home instruments that we sort of check out and check back in, and look at the data that the patient is giving to us. And I will tell you that I have found it helpful in my patients, not only to learn more how much their pressure fluctuates, but I've also used it to know if they're responding to a medical change. And so I was able to publish that to show with just, a sample size of 2 patients, how I found that very helpful in the patient management. One of the patients was a very busy surgeon, and he didn't have all this time to be able to come back and forth, check the medicines, and he was all game, willing to learn this. The other patient of mine was a computer science engineer, same thing, but he was very interested in gathering more data for me. So these patients, though, were so enthusiastic. They gathered more than they needed to, and we still need to learn ourselves, like, how many data points do you need in a day? Well, for me, I don't know yet. We need to do even clinical research on that to sort of get a sampling to know, well, if we get at least 6 pressure points spread out during the day, is that enough? Some of you may know instruments called the triggerfish, which is a contact lens with a coil within the contact lens that transmits some electrical or voltage information. It doesn't give you the exact eye pressure, but it's continuous. So I don't know how many samplings it can give you, but a lot. Do we need that much? And again, the answer is there, I don't know. So we hope with, I would say, participatory based research, which, some Richie, what you were saying is certainly that, and a combination of combining maybe, I'm not sure I'd say our standard clinical trials, but we still have sort of those expectations. If we expect to get funded by NIH, that we have to do some traditional approaches. But if they allow us to start combining some of these new technologies and new approaches to gathering data, like Kayla and Richie, you were saying, I'm hopeful that we will get this information faster. And I haven't seen anybody talk about this yet, but I will have to tell you that glaucoma, with our imaging data, all the visual field data, all the eye pressure data, plus your electronic health record data to tell us a little bit more. I saw questions about sleep apnea, about blood pressure, all of that. We need to harness machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence to really help. This is where I think patients will benefit greatly, and doctors will benefit greatly from actually recognizing more risk factors to tell us who's at the highest risk of progression, who's at the lowest. And then we can really hone in for that patient to really prevent this vision loss.
Yes, those
Thanks,
are great
Sai.
points with Dr. Maroy. And I do just want to mention as well, as a participant in a clinical trial, one thing to remember is that a lot of these trials are very, very, very large. So they're conducted at not just one place, but usually many, many, many different places. Some of them, as large as 100, 200 different locations. And some of them are very small. So maybe it's just 1 or 2 or 3. So in regards to communicating with other participants in the study, I would say most of the time it is a little bit unlikely. Everything that we collect under a research study, we typically do so in a de-identified way, which means that we don't put it under your name or your medical record number, but we keep it under basically a number. So you are labeled basically on a scale of 1 to 500 or something like that, which subject you are in the study, and we keep that data under there. So there is no way for you to know the names of the other people, even at your same location, who might be participating. We do have some trials where the people who are hosting the trial do give the subjects opportunities to actually connect with each other. I know we have one where they're allowed to connect almost through a web forum like this. There's like a big chat room where they can go in and talk about their experiences in that study with each other, which is pretty great because some patients have questions, and it's nice to be able to talk with somebody other than just the researcher who's conducting it, but somebody who's actually going through the same treatment maybe as you or something like that. So it's often uncommon, but I do think that it is possible that you would be able to directly chat with people who are also in the same study as you.
One final comment, and it kind of gets back to the initial one with it depends. There are a variety of different clinical trial schematics and types you may have. Oftentimes, you might be involved in a trial where both clinician and patient have no idea if you're getting investigational product plus whatever you're taking, or whatever you're taking plus placebo, for example. And I was smiling as you were talking about this, Kayla, because I talk with rare disease patients all day, and particularly rare disease advocates. And one of them was involved in a fairly high profile trial for her two young sons. One got investigational product and one did not. There wasn't standard of care. And she did what any mom would. She went online, she found the Facebook group for those involved in the trial. Theoretically, no one knew who was involved or who was getting treatment, who was not. Eventually, she got a stern but fair call from the company that said, look, we're not only do we want to keep everybody safe, right? But we also want to make sure the data is clean and it's generalizable. So Kayla was talking about clinical trials that might be involved at 100 clinical trial sites. The idea is to really standardize all the data collected and to do as much as you can to make sure that data is generalizable to a larger group. So oftentimes, if somebody thinks they should be receiving a particular experiencing a particular response, positive or negative, based on what they think they're on, we know there's a very strong mental component, right? So patients may have a 12% improvement on placebo, for example. But all of that to say, we want to be really, really cognizant of doing everything we can to avoid muddying the data. And that actually takes me to the next question. Sai, I know you're passionate about this topic. I am as well. We talked about generalizing clinical research findings to the broader population. And we have right now a huge number of products where when we look at the demographics of those participating in clinical research, not a good match for the population that's using the products or the population at large. So what about diversity in clinical trials? What is the current state of play, I guess? What needs to be done, and are we moving in the right direction so we can be doing better?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because as Kayla and also Richie, you mentioned, in order to be able to determine if the intervention, whether it's a medicine or surgery, is effective, we try to get sort of a narrow window of individuals that are sort of similar. But the challenge is that leaves people out. And that's on the topic of diversity, which you're hitting upon. And we now realize that it's very, very important that we include different populations. And so I'll just give an example. I am Japanese American, and most clinicians realize that it's unusual. At least I had friends in California say, wow, so I'm older than I look, so I'll just tell you. So it's like, yeah, we have all these Japanese patients and they've got terrible glaucoma. We never measure high pressures. And then, people realize that there is this concept of normal pressure glaucoma as far as that. So others had asked in the note, and I accidentally, I think, finished one before I typed my note here. But there was a clinical trial called the Collaborative Normal Tension Glaucoma Study that found in patients who had normal pressures, meaning during office hours of 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., never detected a high eye pressure. Lowering pressure was effective to slow the progression of the disease. And that was based on visual field testing. But Most of those were in Caucasians. There weren't very many Asians in that, but I do believe that we have to have more diversity in our clinical trials to reflect how we're going to use this data and how we're going to make a decision as a physician to manage our patients. The challenge is that means you need an incredibly large sample size. Kayla said maybe 500, but now if you have it by diversity, maybe we need to have 300 to 500 in each group, to be able to make the studies more generalizable. But this is very, very important.
Yeah, I think a lot about clinical diversity or diversity in clinical trials, excuse me. And with the decentralized and remote technology I talked about earlier, there's so much potential to provide clinical trial access to a wider variety of population, which is tremendous. But I find myself always being the person saying, it's great that you're making trials accessible through technology, but when you're not providing technology or the high-speed internet connection and you're requiring an iPhone 12, you may inadvertently be narrowing the potential patient pool. But the other thing I was thinking about, Syed, and be curious to get your perspective, and Kayla as well. I remember when I started out in clinical research, I guess 12 years ago now, talking with a doc. I guess technically he was a PharmD, so he was a pharmacist in Richmond, Virginia, and he'd been involved in research since 1980. He was from Virginia, he was not from Richmond, but when he started out at this large academic medical center, he was very excited to take on his first trial for heart disease. And he started going through the paper records of all the patients, looking for those who would be a good fit. And I remember him telling me the story 30 some years later, like it was yesterday. He was still so taken back by it. He finds a patient, Ms. Jones, calls her up, she comes on in. And he tells her about the clinical trial and why he thinks she'd really benefit. And she sits there with her legs folded and her hands folded in her lap. And after he finishes, says, "Ma'am, do you have any questions?" She goes, "No, doctor, thank you for calling me, but this isn't a good fit." And he's crestfallen. So he goes into the cafeteria, he's having lunch with his colleagues, and he's telling them about this. And they said, "Jim, tell me more about this patient." So keep in mind, it's 1980. So she says, "Well, she's an 86-year-old African-American woman." So, okay, Jim, she was born in 1896. Mm-hmm. "Where's she from?" "She's from Richmond." "But where in Richmond?" And he provides an address, and they know the neighborhoods a lot better than he does. And after he finishes up his comments and why he's so perplexed, the older local docs kind of laughed and they put their arms around his shoulders and they said, "Well, Jim, when this patient was growing up in town, there was a rumor that's been going around for generations. You did not let your kids go out at night and play by that large university medical center because theoretically they would abduct and experiment on your children." And he was looking at these doctors like, how is that even a thing? But all of that to say, we need doctors that understand context. They're culturally competent. We really need to train new PIs and coordinators that look similar to and can identify with the patients they're seeing. This guy was kind and he was compassionate. He really, really wanted to make a positive impact for Ms. Jones, but he didn't have the contacts and he didn't know what he didn't know. You never can, right? So he was doing his best, but it wasn't what that patient needed, unfortunately. So I try to keep that in mind. All right, we've got some more questions coming in. This is a good one. I hear one of our speakers may have received funding from the Glaucoma Research Foundation to support her research. How did this impact your career, Sai, as a scientist?
Oh my gosh. Yes. So it's I won't under exaggerate. I don't mean to say life changing and trivialize it, but it's so important. I have to tell you, these grants are not easy to get. I've had many more rejections than exceptions. Okay. And these foundation grants, even as grateful patients and donors to your provider or your institutions, all of these are so important. They allow us to get this pilot data so that we can go after these very competitive grants at National Eye Institute, National Institutes of Health. There's other ones, the Department of Defense, as well as the National Science Foundation. And I will say, you know, GRF has done an amazing job under the leadership of Mr. Bruner, you know, I can't say enough about GRF in helping us as scientists and clinician scientists also, for either helping to launch careers, help us get pilot funding so that we can apply and get those very challenging federal grants, and then more importantly, the big one of Catalyst for a Cure. I mean, that's so important. We have a long way to go. It's very ambitious, but we have to reach that high, or else we'll never realize our potential. And I'll have to say that some of those discoveries are, I would say, serendipitous, right? I mean, you may get a result and you're thinking, whoa, this is totally not what I expected. But then you have to step back as a scientist to say, okay, let's interpret this in this context and how are we going to get there? And so it's very, very helpful. So thank you for asking that question, because I was very fortunate in my early career when I didn't get my funding to get some start with Glaucoma Research Foundation.
All right, I'm taking a look at the chat here. I want to be respectful of the time as well. It looks like we are coming to the close of our Q&A. So thank you so much, Sai and Kayla, for the wonderful presentation and Q&A. I'd also like to remind everyone that if it hasn't been made clear yet, the Glaucoma Research Foundation is a fantastic resource for patients. In fact, they're the first place I turned, for loved ones and clinicians as well. Be sure to explore their website to learn more about all of the tremendous resources they offer. What do these entail? Well, incredible booklets and newsletters that you can receive either in print or on their website, www.glaucoma.org, as Christopher has typed into the chat. For the visual learners out there, there are some really great videos as well on the website. You can just type in the questions you have in the search box at the top of their screen, and you'll find multiple resources to help address your questions. If you're on social media, be sure to follow them on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and any number of platforms I am too old and too unhip to be familiar with. All right, one last announcement, and a very exciting one at that. On October 28th, 2021, Dr. Adriana DiPolo will be the guest speaker at Glaucoma Research Foundation's Weston Family Lecture, where she'll be discussing her research. This is a free virtual event and everyone is welcome. Please stay tuned for more details. And once again, we'd like to sincerely thank Aerie Pharmaceuticals for their sponsorship. And thank you for everyone who attended today and for your continued interest and support of Glaucoma Research Foundation. Because of you, the cure is truly in sight.